Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you an audio recording of an interview I did with Anna Byrne, the author of the book 7-Year Summer. In this book, Anna shares her journey with cancer during a summer when she was also a hospice volunteer for a woman who was dying. And so she kind of had dual journeys facing death and end of life issues. It's a really lovely book. So I think you'll enjoy this conversation. Remember to subscribe to this channel down below. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen, and that's End of Life University. And if you'd like to make a small contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air, go to eoluniversity.com/support. So let's go on with my interview with Anna Byrne. Hello and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I want to thank you for joining me here today for episode number 277. Today I'll be sharing an interview I did with author Anna Byrne about her book 7-Year Summer, where she describes her 7-year journey through cancer when she was in her 30s and the story of being a hospice volunteer right after that time for an elderly woman who was dying. So Anna and I have a great conversation about the book and about the spiritual lessons she learned on her journey, and I'll play that interview for you in just a moment. But first, I have a couple of announcements. I want to let you know there is going to be a conference on death and bereavement studies, a professional development symposium taking place on January 10th, 2021. Terry Daniel is hosting this conference, and it's for professionals. It will offer continuing education credits, so healthcare professionals, social workers, chaplains, and anyone who wants to learn more about death, dying, and bereavement. This will be an all-day conference on Sunday, January 10th, and will feature 6 speakers, and I will be one of them, so that's why I wanted to let you know. So I think you'll really enjoy this conference if you're able to attend. And I will post the link to it in the show notes at eolupodcast.com. So come look for episode number 277, and you'll find the link there if you'd like to register for that. Also, starting January 7th, Terry Daniel and I will be co-teaching a course for Redlands University called Spiritual Journeys in Chronic Illness. And this is also a continuing education course. So the link will be there for this course, and it will take place over 8 weeks. And you can read more about it and decide if that might be something you're interested in. Spiritual Journeys in Chronic Illness. So again, the show notes at eolupodcast.com will have all the links you need. Another quick reminder that I have a brand new reading list available for a year of reading dangerously if you're interested in joining people from all over the world and reading 1 book a month about death, dying, and the afterlife. So again, you can go to the show notes and you'll find a place to register for that reading group. And I've actually chosen Anna's book that we're discussing today, 7-Year Summer, as one of the books that we'll be reading next year. So check that out. And now we'll go ahead with my interview with Anna Byrne. And as always, stay tuned. Afterwards, I'll come back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I'm so happy to welcome my guest, Anna Byrne. Anna holds a combined degree in psychology and gerontology, and she's a certified teacher who has worked with youth who have mental health and behavioral challenges, as well as youth in a secure custody facility. She is the previous coordinator for a hospice society in British Columbia. She has survived 4 cancer diagnoses and is the author of the book 7-Year Summer. And you can learn more about Anna and her work if you just Google her name, Anna Byrne, Byrne. So Anna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Karen. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, I wanted to say I really enjoyed reading your book. So I've been very excited about having this opportunity to talk to you about the book, but also just about your experiences. And it feels like the wealth of knowledge that you have gathered over a relatively short number of years through these experiences that you've had. And I was hoping we could just start by letting our listeners in a little bit on more of your story, which is detailed really well in the book, but talking about your journey with cancer, and perhaps how your perspective changed around cancer with each recurrence that you had.
Sure. So I was 32 when I was diagnosed with a very treatable type of cancer, which is common in young adults, Hodgkin's lymphoma. So when I was diagnosed, I had just come back from a trip overseas doing some mission work, and I had returned to my teaching job. And I was given at the time a 90+% chance of being cured. And I remember after a period of shock, starting to grieve. But what I was grieving at the time was not the possibility of death. It really didn't enter into my mind at that time. But what I was grieving was all these losses that I knew were coming. You know, I was in my early 30s, and it's supposed to be a time when the work of your 20s starts to pay off with kind of more solid work and relationships and buying houses and that kind of thing. And for me, the opposite was happening. So I knew that was coming, and and in fact, over the next couple of years, I did feel very out of step with my peers. And then the other interesting thing that happened was this sense of rallying. And it was almost like an adrenaline rush and I'm sure on some level, because I knew my body was hearing these words that my life was going to be changing and I call it this story of overcoming. And so I kind of went into this cheerleader role with my friends and family. I wrote blogs and I asked for prayer, and we all sort of rallied around preserving my life physically and really that hero's journey. So at the time I did 6 months of outpatient chemo, and after that, the doctor said that I had a remarkable response and was cancer-free. Within a month of leaving treatment, though, I was having full-blown symptoms again and was actually had been misdiagnosed and was now re-diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of lymphoma called gray zone, which is a type of lymphoma in which more than one type of lymphoma cell is found in the biopsy. And so I began another treatment, this time that required 4 days in the hospital each time. And the dose was going to be increased by 20% with each treatment. And after the first dose actually rendered me unconscious, but I recovered and went on to get those other doses and had my first stem cell transplant using my own cells. But that was really the beginning of the disintegration of the dominant cancer story for me, the story that I thought if I just tried hard enough and stayed positive, that would be enough to get me through. And after that transplant, I was well for about 2 years. And then I relapsed again. And after more treatment, went to a second transplant at one of the largest cancer centers in the world, Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. And the doctors made it clear at that point that was my last real chance for a full cure. And so I spent a month in the isolation unit there, followed by a year of drugs to control side effects and other opportunistic illnesses. And then at the end of that year, I relapsed again. And shortly after, I started a new targeted therapy which is a therapy that goes directly to cancer cells so that I didn't lose my hair, have other side effects. And I did very well on that treatment and stayed on that treatment for the next 2 years until I began having neuropathy or numbing in my feet from it. And then I left cancer care after more than 2,000 hours in Canadian hospitals, and I was cancer free.
Wow. It's a remarkable journey and a roller coaster in a way, as I listen to it, emotional roller coaster of these ups and downs. It's hard for me to even imagine what that must have been like for you and what you went through emotionally, psychologically, spiritually during those years.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most overlooked things is the psychological part. And I think that's where a lot of suffering comes in. And I know I was just constantly processing, trying to keep up with these losses that just kept hitting me over and over and over, and just trying to psychologically keep up in some way with that.
Yeah, I was thinking about how common it is. You know, I like that you talk about the hero story that you experienced with your first diagnosis, and I see that so commonly in patients with cancer, with really all types of cancer. But it seems like it was really a slap in the face in a way that that story fit the cancer that wasn't even the cancer you had because you were wrongly diagnosed, and that must have felt like such a betrayal in a way.
Yes, and you just learn so much as you go along. And I had a good friend through the process who was an oncology nurse, and there were so many moments of this where the doctors are so wonderful and they know so much, and yet they know so little. And I remember her saying to me, this is why it's called practicing medicine, because we're still just all figuring it out, and we're all doing our best in this, patient and doctor.
Yes, I mean, it's very true that sometimes the way diagnosis happens is by trial and error. We go down one road thinking it's this until we discover it's not, and then that shifts us to another pathway. But a rough and challenging course for the patient who happens to be on that journey. And I was wondering what helped you during those years to cope with so many recurrences and so many challenging treatments that you had to go through.
I think one of the first things is I did have such a good support network of people who didn't expect me to continue that story, to always be perfect, to always be happy, to always keep fighting, and to pick up a lot of the things that I couldn't do, including the emotional part where I didn't always have to feel that had to be happy around them or positive. But I think for me, a lot of it was my spiritual practice. And you get to a place where that normal narrative doesn't work. And over 7 years, I had started out with a very sort of a really good foundation of faith. I was raised Catholic and had done a lot of exploring in my 20s of different Protestant faiths. And then in my early 30s, right around the time of my diagnosis, got into meditation, which has been probably the most helpful thing. It's so difficult to find any solid ground, especially when things are constantly changing with your health. And for me, I had to find that steady place in me, and I had to stop looking for and relying on the medical field or what was happening with my health or any other external factor for giving me that ground, because it just isn't going to happen in our lives. And so it was really important that I found that ground in myself.
I think that's such a good point that many people are looking outside of them for stability and for a place to stand. But you're so right that that we really do find that groundedness within ourselves, and each of us has to find a way to develop that. And some people don't necessarily start out with the tools to be able to develop that.
That's right. And it's just so helpful when you have somebody a little bit further on the path than you are to help guide you in that, because it's hard. And especially when you are going through a crisis or just a difficult time, to keep that perspective and to keep helping you draw on your own reserves, and to even know what those reserves are, and to really start to know yourself and get to know yourself.
And I like that you said your support network didn't require that you stay the fighter, stay on the hero's journey. They were able to allow you enough space to be wherever you were emotionally with the diagnosis, and to not have to portray yourself as always a fighter for their sakes in order to make them more comfortable.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. And, I'll start by saying that there's such a militarized language in cancer care, but also just in our modern culture. We feel, I think, that seeing something as a battle is the only way to mobilize people around an issue, instead of having some mobilizing around love or compassion or care. And so we often go, I think, to this militarized language. And in some ways, it serves its purpose because it does sort of rally people around a cause, but there's so many limitations to that vocabulary. It's a whole set of metaphors that are really based on violence and destruction and dominance. And when we use words so commonly as we do in cancer care, and we do this with fundraising around cancer and motivating patients and trying to get funding for research, we use words like warrior and fought and brave, survival, winning the war. And when we apply this winning and losing vocabulary to a phenomenon that's, for the vast majority of patients, outside of their control, we end up putting this extra layer of burden or guilt on the patient, and often creating this layer of superficiality in terms of how that person can actually feel that they can experience and communicate their own cancer journey. It's not, they're always feel that they're protecting their family and friends. They've got to be brave. They've got to be strong. They've got to be positive. And that if they feel sick or weak, or heaven forbid start to die, that there's disappointment or they're not courageous. And I think this really does a disservice to patients and to their families, who feel like they need to continuously prop themselves up. And I think it's really well-meaning, it's meant, I think, to give us some semblance of control in a really out-of-control situation. But it's something I think that we should start to change.
Yes, I often chafe when I read obituaries that describe, this person lost their battle with cancer. And I see that phrase so commonly. And I find it so hurtful to think that you can only win if you have a cure from the disease, because so often the cancer patients that I worked with through hospice were incredible people, and the learning that they had done on this journey with cancer, even though they were terminal and they were facing death, but the depth and of character that these people had from going through the journey they experienced, the amount of spiritual growth that had taken place in their lives, and just healing and transformation. It was really phenomenal. And for someone to say that was losing, I found so hurtful. And so I agree with you. It's just a black and white metaphor that doesn't allow any room for the possibility that you can still go on this journey with a terminal illness and die in the end, but have had an amazing, wonderful journey. And we don't have to call that winning or losing.
That's right. And I think if we look at the way that all of creation is set up, nobody has ever escaped death. And so I think it really does speak to this idea that nobody wants to die, and that somehow, if we just apply ourselves enough, that we can change that. And we know we can't. But what I would say is, like, let's take the best part of what that metaphor is trying to do and reclaim it. So the real hero's journey is just exactly what you were saying, is this internal fortitude and overcoming and learning about ourselves that happens regardless of whether we die or not, because we know we are going to die.
I like that idea. I like reframing the hero's journey. And because the hero's journey really is all about going down into the depths and going within to search our own selves for
Mhm.
for the best of us and to find our own way. So I like that idea of reframing that story.
Yeah, it's been really helpful to me. And just, right, that's what our whole lives are about. But specifically these moments. And I do find it interesting that we don't say, we don't apply this to, say, heart disease or diabetes. That, if you just do, try the warrior's way, that you can fight a heart attack. And I'm not sure where this has developed from, but it is really fascinating, because you're right, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I have had a concern also that if we're encouraging people too much to fight or to be seeking a cure, which is something you wrote about too, that we might be leading them in the wrong direction, a direction that won't be helpful to them, but that actually distracts them from the work that could benefit them, the work of their inward journey and of just exploring themselves and how to rise to the occasion and be the best person they can be during this time. But if we have our patients focus so much on seeking out a cure, they might completely miss the other path that's available to them.
Yes, I got to this point where, especially after my last transplant failed, as the terminology goes. That's another terminology. These failed, treatments that we undergo. But of coming to that realization of what would it mean if I wasn't physically cured. And I think there is so much emphasis on curing people physically, that sometimes that real internal process of living with the illness, that really also requires attention, kind of gets left to the wayside. And so much is unearthed when we face a crisis. Our priorities are clarified, our hopes are revealed, our fears show up, all our relational patterns surface. It's such an emotional time. And it's so important to be with people during that process. And just like you said, there's people who die from cancer really completely healed. And there's people who survive cancer and they're bitter and angry for the rest of their lives about that journey. So I think you're right that there should be more attention on what is the process of healing in the midst of a disease, especially a terminal illness.
And I think this emphasis on curing disease does not serve medical professionals well either, because once again, as we said, everyone will die eventually. And so if the only way a doctor does
Mm.
anything right or has success is for their patient to live, they are always ultimately going to fail at that task in one way or another. And so to me, it just seems like it's a setup for doctors to feel guilty and full of grief and pain that they can't recover from, and constantly struggling with this idea of failure, when if they could just see the other path that we've been talking about of healing, it seems like it would bring so much more gratification and satisfaction to the doctors in this field.
Yes, and I think, I think people don't want to talk about dying because somehow they feel that that's going to make the person or their family or the doctor, just as you said, feel disempowered or, well, what's the point? But really, it's so freeing. It's so freeing to know that this isn't karma. This is not an error in the system. This is nothing that anyone has done wrong. This is built into the fabric of the cosmos, and we are a beautiful part of that, which means we take our place both in life and death.
Yes, that's so well said. And and one of the things that I absolutely love about your book is the fact that you have woven together your story. You take us on a journey really through your experience with cancer, but into that is woven an experience you had with an, an older woman named Eleanor who was dying when you were a hospice volunteer. And then also, you've incorporated part of the story of your father dying from cancer as well. So the book is really this weaving together of stories, and it's quite beautiful. I wanted you to talk a little bit about Eleanor, the patient that you sat with as a hospice volunteer, because I know that took place after you finished your last treatment, the targeted therapy treatment. Am I correct about that?
Yes, just at the end of that. That's right.
Yeah, so I was really curious about how that came about, how you suddenly went from being a cancer patient to becoming a hospice volunteer and sitting with Eleanor.
Yes, towards the end of my own cancer time, and that with that targeted therapy, I had had a couple of years of feeling really well on it because I didn't get those side effects. So I had suddenly space where I wasn't going to the hospital 3 times a week for blood appointments and follow ups and all of that. And I find that curious myself that I have this newfound space, and yet I'm so drawn back to these situations. And with Eleanor, so I had gone through and gotten my hospice training, and she was the very first person I sat with. And I just so lucked out with her. It doesn't always happen this way where you connect with someone and it's easy, but she didn't have any family in town and she really wanted a volunteer and so was just so open. And so it gave me a lot of flexibility to just sit with her for as long as she wanted and I was able. And it was so simple and yet so profound. She just had this, she was just so okay with dying and could speak so plainly about it and so profoundly about it that she was really okay with this. And she would just say these really humorous things and these really meaningful things and ask these questions. And I just found that I would sit bedside, and when she fell asleep, I'd just start scribbling these wonderful words that she would say down. And so it sort of evolved. I often say that her story was the container for mine. I think having such a prolonged illness made it difficult to synthesize all that had happened with my experience and how do you start to possibly give a glimpse into 7 years of illness. But through her story, it became manageable and I could hold it in that space of kind of bookending my experience with then talking about her experience.
And it created such a nice flow within the book to go back and forth between your journey and then your time at the bedside with Eleanor, because it really felt, to me at least, that you and Eleanor were perfect for one another, that you came along at the perfect time for each other's lives and provided exactly what you needed. I can imagine that the time you spent sitting with Eleanor really let you process your illness and everything that you've been through, and have time and a little distance from which to contemplate everything you'd experienced, but you were able to bring all of this incredible learning you'd been doing through your own suffering, to just be there for Eleanor and be the person that she needed in her life, who could sit with her and who could be a witness to what she was experiencing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen, and for intuiting that, because that certainly is the way it feels. And when we entered that room together, neither of us had an expectation of the other. And that just led to so much freedom to really be who we were. And it was so surprising to me how quickly I felt such deep friendship feelings for her. And I hope she felt the same for me, but that we could go there because we didn't have to put on a show or talk about niceties. The first time I met her, which I recount in the book, she's sleeping when I arrive, and I go to sit down, and this couch kind of lets out this wheezing noise and wakes her up. And she wakes up, and I introduce myself, and the first thing she says is, "I had diarrhea all night." And it was just like, okay, let's get down to this. Let's get to business. And there wasn't this pretense that we would have in any other social situation when meeting someone for the first time. And that's a gift, to be able to do that with someone.
That is so true. That's something that I often found with hospice patients that I loved, was the absence of pretense in a way, because there wasn't time anymore. And also for most of the patients, everything had been stripped away from them. Everything that was false or that didn't matter in some ways had been stripped away. And it was just this raw,
Mm.
beautiful, pure honesty. And I really cherish that. But I would imagine you had come to somewhat a place like that as well, of really not having time for pretense anymore.
Yes, that's so true. And even now, I probably am a little out of step still with my peers. I think you get aged in a way that you can't otherwise, unless you suffer and unless you go through things. It does bring you some semblance of certainly clarity about what's important, um, and hopefully a little wisdom. But it does you cannot go back. You cannot, it's not like I could go back and restart in my 30s what I had missed out on. There was no going back. And so, right, you get to the heart of what's important in life, I think, a lot faster when you get clear really quick about what's important.
And I have long felt that you mentioned suffering, and I felt that suffering is a catalyst for spiritual growth, a really important catalyst. And yet we live in this society that is so avoidant of suffering, and we're constantly being marketed products that will keep you from suffering and stop you from having any kind of pain or disappointment in life. And yet for me it seemed as though suffering is one of the most potent tools in a way for our growth and our transformation. And I know you wrote really beautifully about that in the book as well.
Yes, I wish it wasn't so, but that's my conclusion too. One of my spiritual mentors, Father Richard Rohr, says you only come to such growth by great love or great suffering. And I think in my cancer journey, I was fortunate enough to have both. But in all of our lives, we are going to suffer. And I think we do a disservice to ourselves and each other to think that we're going to somehow escape that, and to spend all of our energy trying to escape that, where, just like you said, most often it is the doorway.
Yes. And I have to really look at how my profession, the medical profession, is complicit in a way with helping people try to avoid suffering by prescribing medications, and just focusing always on, I'll do something to take away all suffering, and yet we can't take it away. The greatest service we could do would be to help people learn how to navigate suffering and how to cope with whatever suffering comes in their life, in addition, of course, to relieving suffering when we can medically, but realizing suffering goes way beyond the physical suffering. And then we just don't offer people enough to help them.
That's right. And I think, right, we often, I think, confuse physical pain and suffering. And just as you were saying, there's the physical pain and discomfort of illness and dying that we should try to alleviate. And I think that's really valid. And then there's this deeper spiritual or existential suffering that happens to people. And I think you can have pain without having suffering. And I think you can have suffering without having pain. And I think we're so well-meaning. And so we've built these things around us to avoid having pain because it is uncomfortable and we don't like it. And we certainly don't want people that we love or are in our care experiencing pain. But right, I think if you don't acknowledge what's really happening, that pain doesn't go away. It just gets buried and it continues to grow. And that fear about dying continues to grow. And really the only way to overcome the fear and the pain is to go right through it.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is the thing I wish that we were helping more people learn. I mean, in your book is an excellent example and a teaching tool for that process of going through and going into the pain. And you having that capacity is what made you such a good visitor for Eleanor, because you could sit with her in any suffering that she experienced and just be there with her, just be there and witness it and go through it with her.
And I think that is the thing when going back to the hero's journey, that's what we can do for people is like, if you help, one of the chapters near the end of the book is I talk about cancer having two blades, and the first blade of cancer clears you. And it is like a clear cut of all the stuff that you thought was important. But it creates space in you. And so that you can develop some resilience in you to hold pain without projecting it onto somebody, without getting angry, without internalizing it and blaming yourself. And you sort of come to recognize that this is part of reality and that you just develop kind of some space to hold that. And I think when you have that in yourself, you're right, that's when you can offer that to somebody else and you can genuinely listen to their pain and ask questions about their pain without trying to nullify it or change it or suppress it because it's uncomfortable.
And I love how you were able to be insightful about that and recognize the gift of your own cancer journey and how you were able to share that with Eleanor then, and by bringing your two stories together, and so beautifully written as well.
Thank you.
There was a favorite, so this is a favorite part of mine that I want to have you talk about. When you described talking about time, the passage of time, and you described the difference between chronos and kairos. And I thought that was really beautiful, but also such a perfect description of, and I even think looking at this year that we've been through dealing with COVID, that time feels as if it's slowed down and it's sped up at the same time. But would you talk a little bit about chronos and kairos?
I became fascinated with this before I knew what those words were, but I started to notice, spending so much time in hospitals, how time shifted and time was not stagnant. Sometimes it dragged on. Sometimes when you had a visitor, it flew by. sometimes it stretched itself or compressed, and it was so elastic. And I just started to take notice of that. And I also took note that there were times when there would be a qualitative change in time. The Celts would call this like a thin place, or the veil was thin, where there is some kind of change in linear time. So chronos is like our linear time. It's how we measure the quantity of our seconds and minutes in our lives, and kind of the length of that. And kairos is this qualitative aspect. It's depth instead of length, and it's got this timeless quality to it. And so most of us, I think, have had this experience where it's sort of like simultaneously waking up and dropping down at the same time into a moment where you're looking at like a new baby, or you're out in nature, or there's some moment that something changes or shifts, and the moment is really ripe, or there's just this alignment, or rightness. This is absolute rightness to that moment. And for me, for some reason, hospitals provoke that. And I think it is sort of what we were talking about, where those niceties drop away, the externals drop away, and something about that situation for me just more easily allows me to drop into this kairos time, where you slow down and your normal defenses of busyness and preoccupation kind of fall away, and you can really see a moment for what it is. And I think for some people that's running or walking, or being with grandkids, but there's this qualitative difference that happens.
And I think kairos is what we're talking about when we talk about living in the present moment, that at least when we are trying to focus all of our energy and attention on the present, that's when we experience kairos. I guess maybe that's the better way to explain it. We experience just the fullness of each moment, and of just observing and participating in life right now as it's unfolding.
I think that's it exactly. You just wake up and you pay attention to what's in front of you, and your body, mind, and heart are finally in the same place, which doesn't happen very much for us, I think.
Yeah, and that's so interesting that you found that in hospitals, and I guess even as a volunteer later on, you were still able to witness and experience that kairos time.
Yeah, and I still find if I need a dose of authenticity in myself and in the world, that's where I go. That's where I go.
That's very interesting. Well, I wanted to ask you, based on your experience of being a support person for Eleanor, Ellie, as you came to call her, do you have advice for people listening who might be a support person out there, either for someone who is terminal in the last stages of life, or even someone dealing with cancer? What do they need to know in order to be the best support person possible?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing I would always say is to reach out. And after I became a volunteer, I went on and became the coordinator of that hospice. And one of the things I see with caregivers a lot is people, there's such a sense of responsibility and wanting to do right by the person that we're caring for, that most of the people who seek help should have done it way before. And they come when they're already approaching or are in burnout. And really the goal is to support everybody in that situation, not just the person who's dying, because it really does take, at least 3 people to really adequately care for somebody and to spell each other off. And so not to wait to look for help and to get other people on board so that it becomes more of a community. And so that primary person doesn't burn out. And then the second thing I would say is just what we've talked about, is about not being afraid, or to be afraid and still enter into that fear, to find that those moments to talk about what's really scary about dying, about illness, and to try and find these little moments, even if it's really uncomfortable or something that's not has ever been part of the relationship, to find these little moments of entry into having those conversations about what people are worried about or concerned about or fearful of, and if you can't ask the question, to just take the chance to share that, how you're feeling about that and what fears you might have, and to trust that process of that will give the other person permission. Most of the time it gives you permission, and to just go there, even though it's scary.
Yeah, I like that. And you mentioned earlier kind of this quality of allowing enough space for the other person to be on their journey, knowing, I mean, you're kind of going on the journey together when you're a support person for them, but to allow that journey to unfold however it does for the patient. It doesn't have to be a heroic, courageous journey. It can take whatever shape it does.
That's right. And everybody is going to do it differently based on their life experience and where they've gotten strength from, and their own coping mechanisms, and what their illness trajectory is, all of those things. And we give each other wide berths of grace, and go gently with each other.
I love that. Give grace and go gently. That's a really beautiful reminder of how we need to be together, and understanding that as the support person, you also have pain and fear that you're going through simultaneously with the person that you're giving support to, and so we find our way together down the path.
That's right. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be, together and authentic as best we can. And we're all learning as we go, and it's not going to be perfect. And that's really okay.
That's another great reminder. No one has to be perfect on either side of it. We just do the best we can.
Yeah, I think that the intention to just be with people know that, and it goes a long way. And you don't have to say the perfect thing, and just showing up is huge.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That's such a good point. Well, I'm curious. I know that this has been an amazing spiritual journey for you now, and I read that you're now completing your Master of Theological Studies, Anna. And so I'm curious about where you are now, what spiritual practices you might use now at this point along in your journey that help sustain you.
One thing I would say is, I am such an advocate of silence and simplicity. And so my life is I just try and keep it as simple as possible, which with lots of silence and stillness and kindness. I think that really does. If we can't give anything else, we can give our kindness. And again, I go back to meditation. I think meditation has been called a brush with death, because you are willfully putting yourself into a position of suspending your own exertion and wishes, and just being who you are for a certain amount of time. And so when I get caught up with, I guess, noise or little things that I know don't matter in the grand scheme of things, but seem so pressing at the time, I think daily sitting in quiet has just helped me to remember all of those lessons as I move away from my time with cancer. I think just remembering those lessons and keeping them in some way to allow them to keep informing my life.
Mm, that's beautiful.
Mhm.
And I was wondering about the process of writing this book as well. Did you find it to be helpful? Did it help you with your healing in a way to actually sit down and put all of this on paper?
Definitely. And I've done so much journaling through the whole process. And I think one of the things is when you have so much contact with the medical system and your life is, literally you're fighting for your life years and years and years. There is a certain amount of trauma that comes with that. And that you're always working through. And I'm sure on some level, I will continue for the rest of my life to process all that I went through and heard and saw and took in, coming in contact with other people that were in the hospital and ultimately died. And so I think writing has always been one of my primary ways of processing. And so a lot of people ask me, did you write this for cancer survivors or their families? And it was like, well, no, I had to write this story because there was just so much. And I think it was just so helpful to put it in finally a linear way and a comprehensive way for my own psyche to get kind of a handle on it, or to put some borders or boundaries on it. But I'm so thrilled that people resonate with the story. And I think whether you've had cancer or not, it speaks, I think, to the universal themes of suffering and redemption and joy and hope that we will all face at some point.
Yes, and as I mentioned before, it's a beautifully interwoven book of stories that deal with your cancer journey, your journey as a support person with Eleanor as she is at her end of life, and grief over your father's death. So it weaves all of those life experiences in a way together. And I personally think this would be an excellent book for a book club to read together because of uh, the the variety of these experiences that you've recorded in the book, and how you describe them so beautifully, the stories that you tell. I think this would be an excellent book for a book club to read. So I don't know if you've heard that before. I know you said your book club had read it. So
Yeah, and I think there is such value in having, I just love book clubs for this reason, because it's such a non intrusive, gentle, inviting way for people to process big topics like this, where everybody takes something different from the book based on their experiences. And it's just a gentle way of being able to process your experiences and your hopes and your fears in the container of a book. And so thanks for that. I think that's a great idea and a direction to look at going.
yes, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see people reading the book, but being able to discuss it with others, because it would help all the people in the group to talk about their own experiences, and to recognize some of the situations they may have been through in their own lives, and how it ties together all of these experiences of illness, dying, and grief. And the book, I should mention again, is titled 7 Year Summer. And where can listeners get a hold of the book, Anna?
Probably the best place is on Amazon. It's on both Amazon.com and .ca.
Okay. So I highly recommend it. Beautiful book. It's a wonderful read, very enjoyable, because as I said before, you're a great writer, and very touching, and very inspiring spiritually as well.
Thank you so much, Karen. That really means a lot to me.
Well, I want to thank you for taking time out to talk with me about 7 Year Summer, and also to wish you all the best as your journey continues. I hope that you'll have more books to write for us down the road someday.
Thank you.
So take care, Anna, until we see one and meet one another in person someday.
That's right. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Anna Byrne. I wanted to go back to a couple of things that I found really important in our discussion. One of them being the use of battle and war metaphors for illness in the medical system, and not just the medical system. I guess we do it throughout our society, but particularly for patients with cancer. And that's something I would really like to see changed, but I feel like it's going to take the will and intention of all of us to try to change that, because it's really language that's ingrained in us at this point. And we just have to become aware of how we talk about cancer and how we talk about the journey through cancer and the experience that patients are having, and become more sensitive to the idea that really creating a black and white win or lose scenario for patients is not very helpful or caring. So I'd love to see that change. And right along with that is the difference between curing an illness and healing a life, and even if that life is nearing the end. And so I felt like that was a really important part of our discussion, and how Anna herself came to terms with the fact that she was able to heal and able to help patients in hospice heal their lives, even if they were not cured. And that's information that I feel everyone throughout healthcare needs to have and needs to adapt the medical approach toward the idea of helping patients find healing of whatever may need to be healed in their lives, rather than simply focusing on curing a disease. So those were two important points that came up during our conversation. I'll remind you that I'll be back next week with another episode. Also, to mention that last week I recorded a vigil, so on December 9th. So if you haven't heard it yet, be sure to check out that vigil for those who are oppressed. I will be back in 1 week with another episode of this podcast for you, so tune in again. If you enjoy this content, please share it with other people who might benefit from listening in. If you feel so inclined, go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to be listening and leave a review for the podcast. That really is helpful. And if you are so inclined, consider also making a monthly donation to keep this podcast on the air by going to my page at Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. So until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever happens next, and love each and every moment of your life. Bye-bye.